that are still alive. But so I interviewed my grandma and my nana about their like memories about the war, and they both have like family members that were in the war, and they were able to tell stories about that. And my nana, Martha Ruth Wilson, she was around 10 years old during the Vietnam War, and her older brother, Lloyd Leo Fenton, was drafted into the war. And this is all their siblings. That's him. That's my mother.
Where's she? Where's she again?
Here's my nana.
Oh, great. Okay.
Um, the thing that she said she was like first remember being like really scared for him when he first got drafted, and she was always watching the TV and like to see what was going on in the war, even if she didn't understand because she was so young. And then my nana would and her family would send stuff to Leo like jerky, and so they could show him how much they missed him. She told us a story about what her brother told her about his injury that he got during the war. He was shot in the leg pretty badly, and he didn't believe that he was going to make it out. But his friends refused to leave him, and once he was safe, he blacked out. And when he woke up, he was in Germany, and he was awarded the Purple Heart. My nana wasn't able to remember any of like much of the any others, like remember much else about the stories that he told her. But she does remember the effects it had on him after the war. She said that they had no idea that he was coming home one day he just appeared at the door, and he was very skinny, and her mom barely recognized him. And Leo died January 9th, 2009, because he had gastrointestinal issues, which made him lose part of his stomach, which was believed to have been caused by Agent Orange. And then my grandma, I interviewed her about her uncle, Robert Welch, but he went by Sonny. Those were, and and his name is, his name is Robert Welch. But and then my grandma was 8 years old when her uncle was in the war. He was a surgeon, and my grandma said that it was a big thing for the family to get together and make care packages for him. And she also doesn't remember the stories that Sonny told about his time in the war, but she does remember hearing about people trying to avoid the draft called draft dodgers, and like some even fleeing Canada. And then the last thing my grandma could recall or like tell me about was like she was telling me about how veterans were treated once they came home, about like them being called baby killers. And she just remembered that was like, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's all I could get from them because they couldn't remember much, but
Yeah. Did you ask them any other questions? They really didn't know.
yeah, I was like asking a bunch of questions, and then like they would like they just couldn't remember, and they were like because yeah, I don't know.
Well, it sounded like they were pretty young when it happened, even though it was
Yeah.
directly affected.
Yeah. My nana, she was like 10, and then my grandma, she was 8.
But that's awesome. You can find the pictures of them. The thing about it is bringing the care packages. Could you imagine what a big deal that was? Even if it wasn't that, just anything. And where are they here now?
My
Where do they live?
my nana, she lives in Mountain Home, Idaho. My grandma, she lives here in Helena.
And did they have any like lessons today or they just didn't?
I didn't even ask him that.
Yeah, if they're going. All right, any questions? Yeah, I love the picture. That's great. And yeah. The interesting about just coming home and appearing. Isn't that just wild? You just imagine just your piece of hair.
Mhm.
All right, good job. Thank you. All right.
For now, all the stuff.
Get it in a minute. And ready? Let me. Okay.
Part of what I talked about, my grandma just sent me like this whole like thing about this guy she brings up. Can I use my phone? She just sent me a bunch of stuff on like this page about him. But
Well, that's kind of cool when all of a sudden you find something else new.
I know so last year I did my old elementary school librarian. Her parents used to campaign for Goldwater, but so that was a lot cooler. But this year I interviewed my grandma Mary, who doesn't remember. She was like pretty young to remember most of it. She was born in 1961. Her name was Mary. She lived in out in a farm. I don't remember where for years until they sold it. She moved to Billings, and that's where she has spent most of her life. And then I'm allowed to talk about this. She's been in the Al-Anon program for years, and a big part of what she talks about is growing up in like the divide, like the Vietnam War caused with like her brothers going to college. But so yeah, she was a pretty little kid when it started. Two of her brothers went to college to avoid the draft, and another one joined the Navy right after. She was one of 11 kids, so she had a lot of older brothers, so she was never really worried about herself being drafted. Obviously, she was like 7, but she was really worried about her brothers for a long time. But she did have a neighbor. His name was Michael Nate, like childhood hero growing up. He graduated from the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, super prestigious school. He was a first lieutenant. She still idolized him like growing up and after the war. But he was killed in action. It was something, distinguished himself by heroic actions on 29th while serving as platoon leader. Like there's like a whole thing about him and just his childhood, how he always served his community. So she idolized him, and then he died trying to like help his men. So she went off on a tangent about him. For question 2, again, she was too young at the time to have too many beliefs on the war, but believed war was a horrible thing that brought nothing good, which is something she still believes heavily. She's a very devout Christian, raised Catholic at first, so she's very like she has mostly pacifist beliefs, but later on in the interview it got really interesting. However, she remembers her parents, especially her father, believing heavily the war was to just fight communism. She grew up in a very conservative household. Again, they grew up on a farm for years. And her brothers, that caused a pretty crazy divide because they went off to college, and she remembers whenever they would come back, there was constant fights between her brothers and her dad because they engaged very much in like the liberal. They never went to any protests. They were always too scared. But they believed heavily in like the anti-war ideology, and so they would bash at their dad all the time. And then 3, she was afraid of the draft, obviously not for herself, because of her older brother. She didn't like the draft then, and even now she's still pretty against it. Pushing forward didn't apply to her. That's about like, what did you see or what did you believe when you were in the military and never served? And then as she grew up and studied the war more in class, much like we are now, her trust in the government quickly eroded, especially after like the whole Watergate scandal was released. She's still now very, very anti-government is the wrong word, but she doesn't trust the government, but not in like a crazy conspiracy theory way, just in like a get these guys out of here way. She still believes now that the war was to fight communists, but nonetheless, she thinks we were doomed from the start and had no business getting involved in the war. Even as she like started getting even at like 12, 13, she realized, why did we have to get involved? Why did my neighbor have to die? And then 6 is about like the whole like the escalation of the war, like McNamara's escalation. She absolutely disagrees with the escalation. Again, she believes we never should have gotten involved in the war. That was their whole thing. That wasn't our deal. She sees it as very similar to what happened in Iraq, which was same response I got last year when I was talking to Sunru. And then with the quotes for McNamara, for the first one, I think that one's about we have to kill people sometimes. She agrees somewhat. However, she went on a very interesting tangent on those she believes deserve to be killed, or like people on death row, or like people she believes just be awful people. But other than that, she doesn't really believe we should just be going out there killing all these like innocent people. And then for the second one about having to engage in some evils, she said she believes sometimes we do have to engage in some evils. Here she went on an interesting tangent about Osama bin Laden and like killing him. That also tied into that last question. And then engaging in some evils, and that sometimes people can't be saved, and saying only God knows when we should escalate. Again, she was raised Catholic. And that last one, she said living in Billings, she doesn't remember seeing a lot of protests growing up because she was pretty little. Even when they did move to Billings, she still lived pretty far out of town. Her dad never wanted her or any of her other younger siblings to engage in anything. So she doesn't remember seeing a lot of it, but she remembers watching everything on the news, and how college changed her brothers. Like she talks about that all the time, how like her brother's going to college and everything exploding because she's very, very anti-marijuana, and her brother started to delve into that when they were in college. And her big thing is how it all just destroyed her family. Especially, because they really were anti their dad after growing up in a conservative household and then going to college. But yeah.
What particular thing did you not know?
I had no idea about like I've heard this guy Michael Nath be brought up a couple of times because every Memorial Day and everything, because we also have another relative named Michael, but I never knew about this guy, and she still heavily idolizes this guy. And I guess I had no idea just how much like whenever I think about the drama in our family, I always assume it to be like these other personal issues that were really bad growing up with them. But I had no idea that my great uncles went to college to avoid the draft and how that like completely changed them and just like destroyed their relationship with their dad. I always thought it was everything in their childhood. So learned all the family drama.
Yeah. At least now you have a little explanation why. No.
Why no one talked
Yeah,
to him.
All right, good job. Thank you. Look at that. Back when we were talking about, he didn't want to talk about his family. His kids participated in anti-war protests. I forgot to say that.
So that's why he didn't want to talk about his.
Yeah.
family.
Exactly. Good job.
Okay.
Yeah, and so you get it. Yeah.
Question, can I send you 2 pictures? I meant to send you it.
Yeah, send it.
Okay.
And Rowan, you want to go now?
Sure. Oh. Swear I'll be paying attention.
Yeah, no kidding.
This guy.
Give me 1 sec.
This guy.
Okay.
Okay, so I interviewed my grandpa, Daniel D. Williams. He talks a lot, so I got through about 7 questions after around 40 minutes. And so I'm like, we're good, I have enough, but thank you. So the first question I asked him is, what were you doing when it started? And he's like, it started around 59, 60, and then escalated to our military involvement. But so he was in high school and he graduated in 1965 was when the draft was really starting to like.
Where at?
Here in Helena.
Okay.
So he's like, I didn't really want to go to college because I didn't know what I wanted to do. But I knew if I didn't go to college, I'd have to be drafted. And so he's like, I'd rather just enlist. And so he tried to go and be a nuclear submarinist. And he passed most of the exams until he got to the physical. And then he failed. And so he was like, okay, fine. I'll try again. I'll go to my doctor instead of their guy. And so his doctor's like, you really want to get in? And he's like, yeah, this is what I want to do. And so he does that again. And he finally gets to Fitzsimmons. And they're like, they all stand up in rows with his buddy because they're like, we're going to do this together. And so he stands up there and the officer calls him. He's like, Daniel D. Williams, can you come with me? He's like, oh no, I'm already in trouble. What have I done? And so he goes back into this back room and he's like, we're doing your physical again. And so he takes a physical and fails another time. And so he failed enlisting and got listed as 1Y. And he's like, I had no clue what that was. I just saw 1Y. It's a really weird sounding name. So I looked it up, and as far as I could tell, it was more like he can't pass the physical, but if we really, really, really need him, then we'll go and get him.
Yeah, 1 means you're eligible, but why? is that?
Yeah. So that's about what happened with him trying to list at that point in time. Later on, when after his second friend gets killed in Vietnam, he goes and he's like, I really need to go and join the army. And so he goes to the army and they look at his record. They're like, you can't join. So he failed to get in twice. But he's like, I guess I wasn't meant to be. And so he goes back to college and does all that. But the next question I asked was, how did he feel about the draft in general? And he's like, well, since I was like perfect age for the draft and I was fresh out of high school, I felt really nervous about it because he said he was raised to trust the government, to trust politicians, trust the president, and to trust his parents. Especially when he was growing up, he had an I Like Ike pin He was really confused by what it was because he had never heard of golf because it was round and red. And he's like, I don't know what golf is because he grew up in Montana his whole life. And so he's like, we fished and we hunted and we water skied. No one played golf. He was the first guy who played golf they ever heard of. And so he was really interested with that. And then I asked him what he thought about the war. And he thought, we were never asked what we thought about if we should fight in Vietnam. The government made those decisions and that involvement. And the more he found out, the more research he did, and the more the news made it evident that we were involved in something perhaps we shouldn't have been in. And he wanted to get out of the war as soon as possible. And he said, "Let them handle it. That's their American Revolution, only in Vietnam." And then I asked him why he got into the war in the first place. He's like, "I thought it was with an alliance with France and trying to stop communism. But the more I heard about it, hippies and free thinkers were starting to come around." And he's like, "You know what? I'm starting to like that stuff." And so one of the main things he said, "I'm a hippie." And that was one of his huge things. He was like, "I was definitely a hippie back then." And so, of course, I had to ask him how his political views changed because of the war. And he's like, "Before the war, I was a conservative Republican. And after the war, I wouldn't have called me a liberal, but I definitely became a Democrat." His politics changed because he only trusted his parents and what they said, and they were very conservative. And he said they had money like Democrats, but voted like Republicans. And so he just thought, I should make my own decisions rather than just trusting people and having them tell me what to do. And the last thing that he really talked about as well, he felt a lot of guilt because he wasn't a part of the army and he couldn't go to Vietnam. And all his friends and his family were there, and he's had to watch so many people die. And so he felt really guilty about it. But he was up in Canada doing commercial fishing when it started to wind down. And he remembers getting on a bus back to Mount Helena and being stopped by a border patrol officer because they thought he was dodging the draft and trying to escape back to Montana in order to go back to where he lives. And so the guy asked him all these questions, and he's like, "I'm sure I smelled like diesel fuel and fish anyway, crappy clothes." But he said, "I live in Montana." And so the guy asked, "So how far is that from Missoula?" And so my grandpa is obviously getting really angry because this is super personal for him at this point. He's like, "It's 112 miles. What else do you want to know? Here's my driver's license." And he storms off onto the bus and leaves the guy in the dust. But he was just really upset with how veterans were like, people were treated, because he remembers veterans weren't treated badly from what he saw, but no one was ever thanked for their service because veterans weren't proud of what happened or proud of what they'd done. So he just felt kind of sad for the people who came home and were having to be mysterious about what they did there and have to try to act differently from what they learned while they were in Vietnam. Because his brother served, and he was like, he was completely different afterwards. Definitely not the same guy I grew up with. And so it just became super personal for him at the end, even though he couldn't go. And he just still feels like guilty about it all. But yeah.
All right, sounds like a pretty good interview.
I cut it down to 4 pages. It was 11 originally. There was a lot more. Like, he met this guy named Doc Bartlett. He was a combat medic in Vietnam. He found him hitchhiking in Reno, Nevada. And then they started a rock climbing school together. As one does.
Yes.
But he's like, and the rock climbing school is how I met your grandma and all that. She was a British immigrant. There was so much. My grandpa's a really interesting guy, and I have so much more from this interview. And like, I already knew some of it, but I definitely did not know half of it because he's a certified yapper, honestly. He goes on and on and on. But yeah, that's
Okay, only one question. What is the one thing you learned that surprised you?
one thing.
You might have told us, but what is, I think you already knew he was a yapper.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Every time I ask him like one question, he goes on like 8 tangents about some life stories he had, and somehow at the end they all connect together.
It's impressive.
Yeah, it's a skill.
He's done like everything, but also is like a weird old man now. But the one thing that probably surprised me the most, was the fact that he failed to get in twice. He tried twice and failed both times, which honestly impressive.
But yet you go rock climbing. Okay, so.
But then he created Climb High, and so then he was with this world-renowned rock climber. He was like the second guy to climb the Dolly.
All right, good job. Thank you. All right, Fiona, you ready?
Yep. I interviewed Tom Campbell. He was born January 7th, 1948. He's half African American, half Native. His father was a Navy veteran, and his mother worked on steamships as a welder during World War II. Neither had high school diplomas. Tom grew up in rural Montana. As a kid, he liked fishing, hunting, listening to music, drinking. How he described himself then was like he wasn't like a kind of simple rural guy. Like he wasn't very educated in politics or history. Like in his words, I was kind of trying to take care of my life with limited options I had. He first learned about Vietnam from the news, the body count they report, the idea that the more Vietnamese were dead, the more secure he was supposed to feel. The media brought the war into the schools, the community. It was, quote, in the air. I think how he described it actually reminded me a lot of how it was like during kind of early 2020 in middle school during the COVID, how COVID was in the air. That's what it sounded like to me. That's like a parallel. So after he graduated high school, it's like 18, he learned he's gonna be drafted. And so to avoid, since he was gonna be drafted, he decided to volunteer for more options. They needed bodies to fight the wars, and there weren't enough volunteers. To avoid it, one had to leave the country, or if you were going to fight, or if you weren't going to fight, the government would just do something else with you. To him, the draft was a hurdle, a barrier. Quote, they could control me. They had the right to tell me where to go and what to do. I think part of him thought it was his duty to serve when called as a citizen of the US. But at the same time, he was hearing about how the war he was being sent to wasn't just. He was hearing about soldiers killing women and children. And he also made it clear that that did happen for both reasons, sensible and monstrous. But he had to do it legally. During the brief period after he was informed he's being drafted, he volunteered for more options and he became a medic. He went to basic training in Washington and then got medical training in Fort Bragg in Houston, Texas. What struck him most was how general and quick the training was. At least him. It was 12 weeks of a little bit more than basic first aid. This was 1968, 1969, towards the beginning of the war, as he described it, and he figured they need a lot of medics and they need them fast. So there was an option for people who wanted more hands-on training. There was a station where they could have gotten more practice after their initial training during the months between when they had to be shipped off. But he wanted to spend his last months in the US doing what he loved. So he joined a boxing team and he was a really great boxer. He loved boxing. And then he was sent straight to Vietnam. Meanwhile, the civil rights movement was going strong. He experienced a lot of racism in Montana, but the first time, as farther away he went from Montana, the more diversity was. He was actually able to see kind of other African Americans. And there was that kind of pride, like he heard about civil rights movement, he liked what was going on. But even then, there was the people the African Americans at Fort Bragg warned him, you got to be impartial when you're over there, just because you can't risk getting drawn into a racial conflict. But yeah, even halfway across the world, like you couldn't escape it. Quote, the ways races were treated differently happens even in war. So I knew early on that I had to protect myself. When I asked him about the time of war, he talked almost entirely of loneliness. To stay safe, he had to avoid getting into any clique or racial group. And so he had to almost distance himself entirely from his platoon in order to remain impartial. That was something he worked really hard on, like try to treat whites, natives, blacks the same, so he couldn't be accused of anything. But he couldn't connect. being biracial just got a lot of mixed messages about who he was from different groups, like having to try and like kind of maintain his own sense of self. Um, but even then, he's just felt a lot of pressure on himself to do his job as a medic the best he could alone. Even he knew the whole platoon helped him, but like, I mean, you're like what, 19? You have 12 weeks of a little bit more than like first aid, people's limbs getting blown off. It's scary. But he thought the medics were treated pretty well over there. But when he went out to serve, he wasn't close to anybody. He didn't stay long enough anywhere to develop community or sense of place. He was in Vietnam 9 months. He got hurt and came back in a medical ship with the wounded. He said he wasn't in a position to be harassed like he heard the other soldiers were. And whether or not the story about people being spat on and the treatment is true, just hearing that story was really disheartening for him. Especially because, like, I mean, his parents were World War II veterans. Like, he saw how they were welcomed as heroes. I actually talked to my grandma and how it was so hard for her parents to accept the reality of what Vietnam was because they felt like they had saved the world. And so to come back and hear those stories was very hard on him. So this was how he described coming back. Those 2.5 years and maybe a decade after, I was kind of lost. I focused on being a good boxer, a good student, a good medic. Vietnam kind of shattered my brain and myself. I was not a complete person when I came home. I drank for a decade straight. That was the only way I felt good. I had to go through a lot of treatment for mental health, addiction, and in there they tried to help me develop a person again that could be sober, social skills. But eventually I went back to my culture and started being recognized by my community, and that gave me hope. It was bigger than my pain. There was a lot of pain in my community, but there was dancing, sweating, smudges, different practices of my culture that was healing me. And if the only meaning I had to have another dinner or live another day when I'm wounded spiritually, physically, that's not going to work for very long. And I pull in the African American too. I'm not the stereotype. I'm not lower than white people. When I can get out of myself, put part of my identity out there, better for me. I'm not just one wounded, hurt person. I'm moving and learning, and I'm showing my pride. One thing that struck me personally, and it is silly, was how he described not having a plan after a good draft. I mean, I know, it's so funny hearing from adults and teachers like, "Oh, I won't ask you what you're gonna do. Like, I won't bother you with that." But hearing how he couldn't have a plan because first he had to survive. So that was interesting. So for me, it was nice because I get to plan. And then I asked him, what was one thing you wish for young people? He said, learn to be a complete human being. Yeah, that's it.
Quick question, how'd you meet him? How did you know?
So he's one of my dad's colleagues. My dad's the executive director of Mountain Mental Health in Montana, and he given a presentation at one of their conferences like back almost a year back about his story, and so he put me in touch.
Any questions? And did you just knew like maybe the little tiny bit?
I watched his presentation,
Oh,
but it
okay.
was so interesting because we first met, our first time talking to each other was on the phone, and so it was just like, okay, I know enough background to know what to ask him, but how do I not creep him out? Like, because imagine like you know on the phone like you know your entire life story is like, and like you're asking like, how do you know this? So it was fun. I was surprised how he thought about stuff because like he wasn't bitter, but how open to life he was, and like how open to like learning and like what he really wants for young people is just like learn how to be a complete human being, like educate yourself, learn to think for yourself, get to know not just learn about the world and the hierarchies that surround you, but also learn to know yourself as an individual. Um, and the idea that that's the takeaway is learn to be a complete human being was cool. I really liked him. He's cool.
Yeah, it sounded like a great interview. Nice job. Anything else? All right, good. Thank you. Hey, we got four, I think we have time for one more, four great ones. June, you wanna go?
Sure.
Well done. Give me 1 sec. Okay.
Okay, hi. I interviewed my Nana Jane and my Papa Mark. So I'm gonna start with my Nana's responses and then I'm gonna talk about my Papa's responses. Because my Nana was born in 1954, so the war was happening from when she was about 6 years old to 17 years old. And then my Papa was born in 55, so they were very similar ages, but obviously him being a man was a very different experience. My Nana went on a lot more side tangents because she didn't know that much about the war politically. Like even now, she still doesn't know a lot about it politically, but my Papa was very involved in that aspect. He's like more logical, black and white thinking, and my Nana was a hippie in high school. So she lived in Geneva, New York, and her family had this old big house. And the first thing that I learned is that her family rented the third floor, so the top floor of their house, to college students, which I never knew. And the one takeaway that she had from it was there was a boy who everyone called Lucky. She couldn't remember his actual name, but everyone called him Lucky, and she remembered he was the only one of the college students who was drafted. And her family did not talk about feelings or death or any of that, but she did remember, like, they never talked about the war or any of that. But when Lucky got drafted, her dad put up this giant map of Vietnam on the inside of their bathroom door. And like they didn't talk about it, but there was this huge map of Vietnam. So she was like, yeah, it was really strange. Like whenever I was using the bathroom and like that was like the main focus. So that was kind of funny. And then less funny thing is I was like asking her what she thought about the military service and like what her kind of general thoughts were about the war. And she said that like the main like event that she could remember is being terrified after finding out about the My Lai massacre. And she didn't really expand on that, but I could tell she was a little bit disturbed. And then I said, at the time, when did you think the United States, what did you think about the United States involvement in Vietnam? And why did you think the United States was at war? And she said, all that I remember is that there was North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and that the North Vietnam were the bad guys and we were helping South Vietnam. And that was kind of all she said about that. She did recall that her oldest sister was 6 years older than her. So her oldest sister was in college at the time, and she remembered when her oldest sister would come home, she would tell them about like colleges like full on shutting down for days over protests. So that was a thing. And then I asked her how she felt about the draft and was anyone close to her drafted. And she said that it was a really scary thing and then it was kind of like an evil possibility that was constantly looming over. And she remembered people avoiding the draft illegally as well. People running off to Canada, people buying their way out of it, which she was really, really opposed to. And then I asked her if she knew if Lucky, the boy who was drafted, lived. And she was like, my parents told me that he lived, but they also didn't tell me when my grandma died. So they might have been lying to me. So that was like a whole other side tangent. And she had this like, she was laughing about it, but it was like scary. And I don't know, it was off putting because she was like, yeah, one day I was like, yeah, when are we going to see grandma? And they were like, oh, she's dead. And then we didn't talk about it. And I was like, oh, cool. Okay. So then she moved on from there.
Got one.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, throughout like my interview with my Nana, I was just like, wow, your family was a little bit like emotionally detached, but okay. Yeah, there was like multiple other things I'll get to. But then I skipped 4 because she wasn't drafted. And then I said, did your view of the war and US policy change as the war unfolded? Did any personal experiences during the war significantly shape your views and have your views changed since the war ended? She started with responding to the last question. And since then, both of her sons, both my uncles, have been in the military, and she absolutely hates the concept of war. And she said nobody asked mothers anything about war, which was kind of sad. But she also said that she understands the need for soldiers, but she fears the ripple effect on innocent people. And then she also talked about how she was like obviously opposed to the war because she was a hippie in high school, but she didn't really talk about it. And then she was talking about veterans after, and she said a few years later you would meet somebody from Vietnam, and it wasn't like you instantly honored them. You just wondered what the hell they went through. And there was a lot of heavy drinking and pot smoking, and people just didn't know or talk about PTSD. So that was sad. And then other strange side tangent that she remembered. She was like, yeah, I remember that in junior high, it was really, really cool to wear army jackets. So apparently that was a thing, which she was like, it was like the one thing that she really remembered. And she was like, yeah, that was kind of weird. And then she kind of moved on. I was like, okay. And then I asked her what other memories from this period she had, because a lot of the stuff about McNamara and stuff, she just did not really know anything about them, so she didn't really know how to respond. Like obviously she was opposed to the war, but she just wasn't super aware in that aspect. I was aware before this that her mother died of breast cancer during this time period. She died when my man was 16. But that kind of reflected her views of the war as well, because so when her mother got breast cancer, I found out that she did not tell anyone. She didn't tell her husband. She didn't tell any of her kids. She didn't tell any of her friends or family. And so she wasn't really going to doctor's appointments or any of that. And I found out that she was wearing a really giant poncho for a while because her arm was really swollen. And so, like, after a couple of months, my Nana's dad was like a football coach, like, kind of like, oh, guy. And so he wasn't like super, super involved. And so, like, after a couple months, he realized something was up and she told him that she had breast cancer. And once again, they didn't talk about it. She said the way they handled it was to get in the car, go to the local Friendly's restaurant, and get an ice cream like they did every Friday before they went to the hospital. And she was told she had 6 months to live. So that was really dark. But from that, she said that it did affect her view of the war because she learned that we have to have a voice and that it's really healthy to do that. And it's really healthy to talk about things. And she said it isn't healthy to hate, and she really did not like that her parents didn't talk about things, and that definitely reflecting that. She also talked about like the huge shift in younger generations when it came to diversity, and why that personally reflected on her is when she was around 14 or 15, she started dating a Black man who was named Ted, and her parents grounded and punished her about it and threatened to send her to private school, which was really strange. And so they had to sneak around with their relationship for a while because they tried to get her to break up with him. And it sounds like she told them that she did, but she did not, because they didn't break up until college, which she met my papa in college. I also have pictures of them in Teams chat if you want to follow them.
We'll look at it.
So yeah, that's my Nana. Some really dark things found out about that. My papa, as I said, was a lot more logical. He didn't share as many personal anecdotes from the time. He more just like focused on the political aspect of it. So this is a photo of my Nana and Papa, like after they had my mom and her brothers. So that's my Nana and that's my Papa. And then if you go to the other photo, that's my Papa, and that's him when he was younger. I just love that photo so much.
Great.
Yeah, so I asked him, what were you doing during the period of the Vietnam War? If you were in the US, were you drafted or did you enlist? When did you serve? If you were not in the military, where were you and what did you think about military service? My papa also does not talk about feelings. So I have not really heard that much about his life. Like, obviously I know him very well and I spend a lot of time with him, but I learned a lot. I found out that he was registered for the draft, but he was in college, so he had college deferment. He turned 18 in 1972, so he was born in 1955. He started laughing when he told me this. They laughed a lot during this. It was definitely a coping mechanism. But so he was telling me about how the draft was a lottery system, and he drew number 17, which he goes, was so lucky, and then proceeded to tell me they were taking like up to number 100. And so he just thought the fact that he drew a really, really like small number was really funny now. And he didn't think it was funny then, but he thought it was really funny now. He told me that he was going to ROTC, which meant that he was going to finish college and then go as an officer. He told me that he voted for Nixon, even though that was not the thing to do. And Nixon ended the war in December of 1973, so he never ended up having to go to Vietnam. He also told me that he wasn't opposed to going to fight, though, because I found out that apparently his father was in the Korean War and that his grandpa, so like our first generation to come to the United States, I found out he was from Sicily. I found out that our family earned citizenship by his grandpa enlisting in the army. So didn't ever know that. That would have been cool to know. But I found that out. And then I moved on. So I said, at the time, what did you think about the United States' involvement in Vietnam? Why did you think the US was at war? Immediately, he told me he understood this, like stopping the spread of communism after World War II. But what I thought was really interesting is he was the oldest of 6 kids. So he described it as someone has to be the big brother so people don't kill each other and then everybody hates the big brother, which was a little strange, but I like a direct quote. He goes, if Eric's got Joe's toy and they're about to kill each other, somebody's got to step in, take the toy, and then they both hate you. So that was an interesting way to describe it.
I know you have a little bit left.
Yeah.
But we got, let's go into, we'll pick it up right
Okay,
there.
yeah.
With the Toy Story. And so if you steal a toy,
That was like the most like personal thing he said the whole time.
and I get families that are not very open about things, so I understand
It
completely.
was so
How about a mini applause? We'll finish it tomorrow. All right, here we go. Nice job. Hey, everyone did great. We'll pick it right up. Nice job. Those of you who give me the paper, please give it. These are a lot of fun. I always enjoy them. Well done.